Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and selamat sejahtera. Welcome everyone to this session on using Bloom's taxonomy to write questions. So I am Widariah Muhammad Yusof. So at the end of this session, you should be able to identify the relationship between the cognitive level of course outcomes and written questions, and secondly, to be able to use Bloom's taxonomy to construct or to craft effective exam questions. Now, the underpinning notions of all test items are learning outcomes. So, to maximize testing, we should aim to integrate all the major components of a course. And then using the revised Bloom taxonomy will help us to clarify what we want students to learn and also help to tie concepts to the level of questions we ask. So the characteristic of effective exams include it must be valid, reliable, recognizable, as well as realistic. So what is a good question? So the most basic and obvious answer to that is good questions measure what we want to measure and bad questions do not. Okay, let's recap again the revised Bloom's taxonomy. Okay, so this taxonomy, you have seen it earlier in the first workshop. So although the revised Bloom taxonomy focuses more on teaching and learning rather than assessment, however, we can still use it as a guide in the construction of written questions or test items. Now, the basis of the revised Bloom taxonomy is the taxonomy table. So it's now a two-dimensional system for classifying knowledge, which is reflected on the left-handmost column. So you can see the facts, concepts, procedures, metacognitive. Those are all the different types of knowledge in the knowledge dimension. And then we have the uppermost row, remember, understand, apply, up to create. Those are all the level of cognition. That is the cognitive processes involved in handling the knowledge. So the revised Bloom taxonomy informs us on the kinds of knowledge that can be tested. So there are basically 4 different types of knowledge. The factual knowledge, for example, terminology, facts and figures. Conceptual knowledge, the principles, theories, frameworks. Procedural knowledge, example, algorithm, techniques and methods. And metacognitive knowledge, knowledge about self, strategy, knowing how you know. So we already know that the key to creating effective questions is constructive alignment. So the taxonomy table allows us to categorize learning or assessment in one or more cells as shown in the figure. So from there we can now create a table of item distribution or the table of specification. So sometimes also called the test blueprint. Now this table helps us to align outcomes, instructions and assessment. Now actually the TOS can be used for a variety of assessment methods, but most of the time it is commonly associated with constructing test items. So creating the questions. So the first thing that you need to refer to is the cognitive level specified for the course learning outcomes. So the keyword verbs for each level. So you can see a list of possible keyword verbs on page 7 of the OBE assessment workbook. Some samples of the keyword verbs is also shown here on the diagram. And then you need to think about the format. of questions that you want to create. So is it going to be in Gobbet form, in ordered outcomes, concept maps, Venn diagram, etc. So question to ask. So the table shows the level of cognition and sample of active verbs that we can use. For example, if you want to measure, remember facts or terms or principles or procedures, then you can ask students to define, to describe, to label, to list, and so on. Okay, so same goes with if we want to measure create, which is the integration of learning from different areas as well as solving problems through creative thinking. So asking students to categorize, to devise, to design, to generate, to plan, those are all the appropriate verbs that you can use in creating the questions. So example of mapping verbs. So the taxonomy table reflects knowledge tested and different forms of thinking as indicated by the verbs. So we can readily see the important aspects of the course being emphasized, the alignment, as well as those aspects that are being left out. So what type of questions? That's the test format. Now you need to be clear on what you are trying to assess. Because if you are clear on what you want, then it will make writing questions much easier. So here are some examples of test format. The objective questions, the short answer questions, essays, hotspots, take-home open book exam, and so on. So by the way, I had included a video on writing open book exam questions. So it is highly recommended that you watch the video. So there is no single best type of exam question. The important thing is that the question must reflect your learning outcomes. What to test? In general, it includes consolidation of basic knowledge, higher cognitive skills, specifically level 4, 5, and 6 of the Bloom taxonomy, problem-solving skills, and written communication skills. So this is an example of matching type of questions where you ask students to pick the phrase in column B that most accurately defines each of the phrases in column A. So example of multiple choice questions. So you can see that the MCQ type of questions, the structure must have 3 important elements, that is the stem, the distractors, and the key. So the example given here is a paper-based question and a hotspot version of the question. Now hotspot means we upload an image and ask the students to specify certain area in the image. Okay, let's look at the example of the hotspot. Okay, so this is actually the image given, and then the question is to ask the students to move the appropriate descriptive terms from the list to the form and attitude boxes below. So what the students need to do is basically drop and drag action. Okay, so this is what we call hotspot type of questions. So this is an example of open-ended or open response questions, meaning that there is no one correct answer to the questions. So the question given here, for example, what do you plan to do immediately following this workshop on OBE? So each and every one of you will have a different answer to this. Okay? Or how do you go about buying a house? So each of us have our own reference. Gobbet. So Gobbet is an extract of text, a passage of literature, an image, a cartoon, an artifact, a map, okay, which we provide as a context for analysis or discussion in an assessment. So the student task is to identify the Gobbet, explain its context, say why it is important, what it reminds them of, and whatever else you would like them to comment on. So this is an example of a Gobbet, okay, where we provide a picture as the context and we post the problem. So if you look at the questions, it is about designing. So we know that if you ask student to do the design during exam, it is time consuming. But we still want to address the high order cognitive abilities such as analyzing. So rather than asking them to do the design, we could ask them about the information required to accomplish the task and how would they use the information. So this is another example of Gobbet where we provide a scenario and use the scenario as a context for analysis and discussion. So this format of questions is useful in assessing higher order thinking skills. Now, Felder proposed what he called a generic problem, which we can use as a template to create higher order questions. So given that we describe the process of system to be analyzed, then write in order the equations you would solve to calculate, then state the quantities to be determined. Because according to Felder, if students can write the equations that can be solved for the variables of interest, given sufficient time, they could go through the detailed calculations. So another format of questions is what we call the ordered outcome items. So this kind of question consists of a stem with 4 to 5 sub-items. So the stem provides sufficient information for the questions, and the sub-items are ordered in the hierarchy of complexity from low order to higher order. So there's another taxonomy known as the solo taxonomy that we can use as a guide for constructing the sub-items. Now solo stands for structured ordered learning outcomes. So student answers to the sub-item question will indicate the level of competence in that topic. So this is the solo taxonomy as proposed by Biggs and Collis in 1982. So it constitutes of 5 levels. So what's actually the difference between solo and Bloom? Now, if we were to put the solo taxonomy and Bloom taxonomy together in comparison as illustrated in the diagram, so you can see that the Bloom's level with sample verbs for learning outcome showing different levels of cognitive processes, okay, is aligned with the levels of solo taxonomy, which shows the quality of students' learning and how they learn. It looks like they are comparatively correspond to each other. However, so if you look at this cartoon, it illustrates the major difference between the Bloom taxonomy and the solo taxonomy. Okay, so Bloom taxonomy presupposes that there is a relationship between question asked and the responses to be elicited. Whereas for solo taxonomy, both the questions and the answers can be at different levels. Okay, so this is what is being illustrated here. The teacher is asking a question at level 2 of the Bloom taxonomy. Okay, it's about understanding. And if you look at the responses given by the students, they are all incorrect. Okay, that means that the students do not understand the concept of daya. So solo taxonomy is much better in showing the quality of students' learning. Because the responses, although the question is at level 2 of the Bloom taxonomy, but the responses of the students are actually pre-structural, meaning that although the student gave answer, but they are all incorrect. So this is an example of an ordered outcome questions. So we have the stem of the question, that is a sequence of odd numbers. So part 1, 2, 3, 4 are the sum items. So the question is structured from low order to high order. So part 1 and part 2 is at level 3 of the Bloom taxonomy, part 3 is at level 4, and part 5 is at level 6. So students' answer to the sum items will indicate their level of competence. So the ordered outcomes question sometimes is useful to discriminate between weak students and good students. For weak students, they can answer the low order questions. But for good students, they will be able to answer up to the highest level, which is level 6. Now, the reason why sometimes we need to include low order is to give the weak students a sense of success. So in a way, it will give them a motivation for learning. So these are some questions that we can use as a guide in the development of the test item. So we can consider this as a checklist to check whether the questions that we have created are appropriate to their cognitive level. So we have come to the end of the presentation. So this is a 1-minute evaluation for you to answer. So reflect on where you are in the session and complete the following statements. So your response to the statement will indicate what you have learned and what you have not. So thank you.